So one of the key understandings for a focus-based practice like Ashtanga Yoga is that mental focus follows visual focus. And that's very important because it ties in with this concept of Drishti, which is one of the three fundamental elements that makes Ashtanga Yoga moving meditation. It allows us to go into this flow state that we practice towards. Those elements are the breathing technique, which we maintain throughout the practice, the actual asanas, the positions themselves, and the energetic circuitry that comes along with those positions. And finally, this idea of Drishti, which is kind of loosely translated as gazing point. And that's not a bad translation because it indicates how Drishti should be taken. It really is just a soft gaze towards a certain focal point in space. It shouldn't be too hard of a stare, and it's not this intensely cross-eyed expression that you sometimes see in the yogashala. But really, to understand more about how and why we practice Drishti, it might be useful to take a look at some of the mechanics of the human eye and the brain that perceives the image coming through the eye. So for us as people, most of the time we walk around with this very dilated gaze, just trying to take in as much information from our surroundings as possible. And when we see the world through that wide angle, we don't really receive any one part of the image in a much higher resolution than anything else. And that's not exactly the way we focus the eyes when practicing Drishti. So when we are on the mat, I would say there are two perceivable ways that we use the eyes to focus. And first would be just a very soft focus. So none of the lines of the image, very definite, very defined, almost like a blurred vision experience. And that is particularly useful when the Drishtis are off body. So that would be Parshva Drishti, Urdhva Drishti. My teacher Sharath describes those drishtis as just looking into open space. It's kind of like you're trying to look at the air on that side of the room. Then second, we have a much sharper focus. And so we really do see the object of our focus in high resolution, and we can have a tunnel vision experience looking at it because we'll necessarily sacrifice the periphery of the image. This is particularly accessible in those drishtis which are on body. Sometimes it's the big toes, the thumbs, the fingertips, etc. We can really see that object in high definition, and everything else is just not being paid much attention to at the moment. It goes very blurry. So how come there are these two perceivable ways that we're focusing the eyes and they just fall both under this blanket practice of Drishti? My take on that is that we use a certain focal distance which is maintained throughout the practice. It's a bit like if you've had the chance to play around with a camera like this one, where you can just flick it into manual focus. What that does is it prevents the lens from searching around for something to focus on, and it just holds the focal distance. So if the subject's exactly in the right focal distance, it'll be in focus, and then if you move it further away or too close to the lens, you'll be receiving a blurred image coming through the camera. It's similar to how we use the eyes to focus, but we just kind of have an approximate focal distance which keeps our awareness in this close proximity to the body, within about an arm's length away from the body. And then if we're looking out in a direction and there's nothing there, then we'll just be receiving a blurred image rather than casting the gaze across the room and searching for something to focus on. So really, ultimately, it's not all that important what the image is that we're receiving through the eyes. It matters more that Drishti is being held with a sense of purpose. There's an intentionality behind it. Drishti should very much be taken in the same way as asana, and that is with a sense of stability and ease. So that's to say, it should be very focused, deliberate, intentional, immovable. And at the same time, it should be comfortable. It shouldn't be tiring for the eyes to practice Drishti, even for a very long period of time. It shouldn't be assisted by the muscles around the eyes. If you're kind of receiving two hard images overlapping with each other, that is probably doing it a little bit too intensely. I can't imagine that would be a very stabilizing way to move through your practice. The direction that we focus the eyes also has an energetic effect on the experience that we're having. So just as a general rule, and this will vary a little bit from one asana to the next, but when casting the gaze up, anatomically up, so up compared to the face, that will provide a certain pranic element to the pose, an uplifting energy to the asana that we're practicing. When casting the gaze intensely downwards, that will provide an apanic, grounding, stabilizing energy to that pose. And interestingly, when casting the gaze to the neutral position, that would be towards the tip of the nose, that is the neutral energetic experience, and that would be Nasagre Drishti, looking at the tip of the nose, which is the default Drishti, the most common Drishti in the Ashtanga practice, and it's It's therefore the one that you can revert back to if you ever need to. If it's energetically overwhelming to hold the drishti for a certain pose, if that drishti is not accessible to you for one reason or another, maybe you just don't know what the drishti is, you can always revert back, still carry on practicing, just substitute in with Nasagre drishti. Ask your teacher when you get the chance what is the correct drishti for that pose. So when we hold the eyes in the way that we do when practicing drishti, we are actually sending a message from the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. And I'm not speaking about this in a sort of esoteric or airy-fairy way. For now, I'm just purely speaking about human physiology. But there are parts of the brain which are consciously controlled. I am going to observe this drishti, and parts of the brain which are unconsciously carrying out their functions, telling the organs how to do their jobs, communicating with the heart to pump blood around the body, etc. That is not consciously controlled. It's just happening. And so when we send this message to the unconscious mind, we're essentially doing so through our physiological actions, which is the narrowing in of the gaze, holding the eyes in a certain place, preventing them from moving at any slight vritti or fluctuation of the mind. And essentially what that communicates to the unconscious mind is that now is a time for neural plasticity. Neuroplasticity is essentially change occurring to the brain and the nervous system in response to the experience that you're having. So it's this integrated learning experience, really knowing something deeply within your nervous system, like knowing it with your body. It's a little bit different to learning something and just holding it on the surface of your brain so that you can repeat it once. And so we really need to set the stage for neuroplasticity, especially in human adults where it's kind of difficult to come by. In children, for example, their brains are constantly in a heightened state of neuroplasticity. That's why they pick up new skills so easily, new languages, musical instruments, etc. For adults, our nervous system is much more set in its ways, in what it does and what it doesn't do. But still, through a focused and dedicated and consistent practice, we can pick up these new skills and integrate them well and effectively into the nervous system. So when we open up this pathway for neuroplasticity, essentially the brain will release certain chemicals. Very interestingly, among those are norepinephrine and acetylcholine. I'll just touch on what those are, but I recommend you look into it further because there'll be much more to it than I can go through in this little talk. But norepinephrine is essentially small amounts of adrenaline being released directly into the brain, provides a stimulant effect, gives you this motivation to keep going through the experience that you're having and to integrate that experience on a deeper level. So it does provide this sort of nervous system arousal, and for a practice like Ashtanga, we need a certain amount of nervous system arousal and a certain amount of calm to have the kind of energetic balance that we need for this practice. But if you imagine an extreme example of your body experiencing adrenaline, such as you would if you were skydiving or going through a very stressful event, what that does is that it gives you this huge burst of energy to get through the situation no matter what it takes, because the situation could potentially be a life-threatening one, and you'll also necessarily really hold on to that experience with your body because your body knows that it needs to learn from it now. It can't necessarily afford to have these kind of events coming up repeatedly. And that's also the reason why when you go through a traumatic event, it can be very difficult to let go of some of the residual effects from those kind of events, even if they're not necessarily of service to you after the event. It's just a defense mechanism that your body has to hold on to those experiences. So this is not really like that. It's just very small, natural, manageable amounts of adrenaline being released in the brain, and it really assists with the learning process. I suppose a more similar example to our practice of Drishti would be if you do that same narrowing in of the gaze, looking at a piece of paper and just hanging on every word, soaking it up like a sponge, fascinated by what you're reading. That is a more similar norepinephrine response. And then acetylcholine is really interesting as well because it deals with the body's ability to sort through its what's coming into its sensory awareness and to hold your point of focus and amplify that, give it center stage, turn the volume up on that particular aspect of your focus, and then to take everything else that's coming into your sensory range of awareness and kind of push that into the periphery. Turn the volume down on those aspects. So you can imagine this is going to be really useful for any kind of meditation practice. That it's essentially like right now you can hear the sound of my voice and you're listening to these words, but if you really search for it, you'll probably find that you have access to other sounds as well. So maybe that'll be the low hum of your refrigerator, or the wind whistling through the trees outside, or the birds, whatever it may be. You might not have even noticed that you can hear those sounds because you're just not listening to them at the moment. This is kind of why when you go into a very hyper-stimulating environment, you'll start to get tired. You feel fatigue from that experience even without physically exerting yourself. It's just because your brain, and a particular part of the brain called the thalamus, is just constantly being bombarded with all this sensory information, and with the help of acetylcholine, it's able to kind of sort through that so that you can give priority to the voice of the people that you're with, rather than all the people in the venue having the same priority of voice. But essentially these chemicals and others will come together to put the body into this heightened state of focused awareness. And it's really ideal for integrating a complex practice like Ashtanga Yoga, especially in the initial stage of the student's practice. There's so much to keep track of. The sequence is fairly complex if you've never done anything like it before. There's all these energetic experiences that might have never come up for you. There are physical sensations in the body that you might have never felt, emotional stirrings. There's all this stuff that needs to be processed and integrated. And so it really helps to put the body into this kind of state so that you're no longer just going through the motions, you're actually really putting in a conscious effort and integrating the practice on a deeper level. Over some time of practicing it consistently, and that really is a key part of it, practicing with consistency, the nervous system starts to get the message that these positions are familiar. Most of them are accessible, many of them are even comfortable, and you start to be able to move from one position to the next, to the next, to the next, in a way that is very effective and very efficient. With some time of practicing the positions effectively and efficiently, then the nervous system will begin to take the reins, and it starts to pull the body through the practice without relying on your thought and sort of cognitive conditioning to negotiate your way into the next part of the sequence. Your body starts to move without thinking, and that is the flow state that we practice towards. That is moving meditation. That's what the Ashtanga practice is all about. And essentially, this flow state exists only once the practice has been integrated into the nervous system adequately well. It tends not to be that available in the very early sort of learning stages of the practice. And so you might even still be able to have glimpses of it, but they might not even be sustained for long enough that you even notice that they're there. So the flow state tends to exist much more accessibly in a very different stage to the learning state. And then of course there's all this gray area in between, which is where most students find themselves on any given day. And you might even be able to assess in hindsight, this morning I was able to go through this section of my practice very well in a flow state, and then I had this section which was a lot more sort of cognitive, me negotiating with my body how I'm going to get into and out of this pose, how deep I'm going to be able to go today, etc. All this little internal dialogue that is part of the practice experience, but ultimately what we're practicing towards is going more and more into that flow state. And so while you're in the flow state, the practice of Drishti is going to be fundamentally important as well, because the eyes stay open. So you'll want to receive an image that communicates that you are in the right place at the right time. You move to the next position, again, right place at the right time. And you're essentially giving your nervous system permission to keep hold of the reins and keep that flow state going, keep it maintained for a longer period of time. And so Drishti is going to be fundamentally important throughout your practice experience. And ultimately, that flow state is going to be permitted to happen by having a practice which is well grounded with a solid foundation in the Tristhana, in the practice of the breathing technique, the asana, and this practice of Drishti. That allows the flow state to just naturally happen. And it really does not matter whether there are sort of frills and fuss of advanced asanas and things that look very complex or anatomically complicated. That tends to come kind of as a side effect of the person practicing for a long time and really integrating these movement patterns into their body. But it's not causative of the flow state. It's just happens kind of alongside it, or it might not even be part of the person's process. But ultimately, just this solid foundation in the Tristhana allows these states of flow and the deeper meditative states to occur in the Ashtanga Yoga practice. All right, so I think I'll just leave it at that for today. Thank you so much for watching the video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned a thing or two. If you did, feel free to subscribe to this channel for more videos. See you in the next one.